Hey, it's Luke in Signal Sounds, and today we're going to take a look at this, the Teenage Engineering OPXY. The OPXY is a new flagship instrument from Teenage Engineering, and it combines aspects of the OPZ and of their OP1 field. There's a ton of features on this. Some of these are unique to the XY and others have been developed further from the previous devices. And in this video, we're going to look at 3 of my favorite features of the OPXY and how they can improve your musical productions. So let's get started. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is the punch-in effects on the OPXY. Now the punch-in effects are a way of kind of just making dynamic changes to the patterns that you've already created without you needing to go in and edit any of those patterns manually. Now there are 2 types of punch-in effects on the OPXY. You have the main one that a lot of people kind of already know about, which is in the auxiliary tracks, and it's on channel 2. And this one is where your left-hand side does all the sort of like percussive punch-in effects, and the right-hand side does all the melodic ones. You also have this second one, which is on individual channels. So all you have to do is when a sequence is running, you press shift, and then you kind of use the punch-in buttons there, and you can do per track punch-in effects as well. So one of the main ways that I'm using the OPXY's punch-in effects is to create interesting transitions from section A of a song into a section B of a song. I think one of the weaknesses of making music in a hardware-only format is sometimes it's quite difficult to do transitions that sound as polished or as interesting as stuff that you can meticulously draw in a DAW. It's just quite difficult to replicate the amount of detail and all of the sort of small little changes that you can draw in over time in a DAW. But the punch-in effects do a really good job of kind of creating those interesting changes. So here's an example where we're not even going to change the pattern. I'm just going to create the dynamic changes just by using the punch-in effects. So here's what we start with. And with some punch-in effects. Now, you can hear we've kind of created a really interesting transition there, and I didn't need to change the pattern. Now, these punch-in effects are also recordable as well, so you can sequence those and kind of have those as part of the scene structure as well. So if you don't want to do it on the fly, but you still want to have those interesting transitions that you can get from the punch-in effects, you can just have those stored as part of the sequence as well. So here's another example where I'm going to use the individual track punch-in effects. I'm just going to be changing the bass line for interesting variations in the pattern. Here's what we start with. And with some punch-in effects. And you can play multiple at once if you want to kind of get really ratchety. So hopefully you can kind of hear the punch-in effects use cases here, where you kind of either want to generate transitions or just changes, and you want to do that dynamically. It's quite useful for live contexts where you maybe just want to kind of be interacting with the sequences that you've already written, or it could easily just be a compositional tool to generate changes that you maybe otherwise wouldn't have thought to do. So the next thing I wanted to look at utilizes the multi-output on the OPXY. Now, a multi-output, I think, is a new concept. I've certainly not seen it on other devices. It's essentially a TRS output jack, and it can be utilized for numerous features that use that connection. So, for example, you can use it for dedicated MIDI output, so it can send MIDI. It can also be split into do CV, so you can do CV and gate to sequence and modular. And the last thing it can also be used for is for sending audio. So it can send a stereo send out, and then there's also an audio input on the OPXY, so you can use it as a stereo send and return. Because the other 2 things in the multi-output, like MIDI and CV sequencing, are kind of a little bit self-explanatory, I wanted to focus on the stereo send and return because I think it's a really interesting feature. What's really nice about it is it essentially gives you another channel of effects, basically. So you have effects 1 and effects 2, and they can be any combination of like delays, reverbs, distortion, that kind of thing. With the third send and return effect, if you're using it for that, you can choose what channels go to it, just like the regular effects. So in this instance, I'm just going to be sending one channel from the OPXY to it. And then you can bring that back in and you've got control for dry wet as well as the level and that kind of thing. So it's essentially like having another effect, except the other effect is a hardware box, which is really, really useful. So in this example, I'm going to be sending just a single track out from the multi-output as the stereo send and return. And it's going to be this short staccato sound here. And we're not hearing the sort of delay or the sort of Cosmos effect because I haven't hit record. It essentially works like a looper. So I'm going to need to hit record in order for you to hear it. But yeah, here's the whole track, and then you'll see me press record and you'll hear the Cosmos come in. And if I turn the feedback down, Cosmos almost forgets what it's recorded. And so I can kind of take little snippets here and there from what's being sent, rather than just everything is going through it all of the time. Now obviously this is an ambient example, but you could really think about the numerous different ways that you could use this. You know, if you think about running some drums through compression or distortion, you know, the options are really, really wide for having this stereo send and return. And it's a really useful feature that I love to see on a product, and it's definitely the smallest product that I can think of that has this feature as well. Now the last feature we're going to take a look at is the brain function. Now I must admit, the first few attempts of using the brain, I got absolutely no joy out of it whatsoever. I just kind of thought it made everything sound a bit weird and wonky, and I kind of discovered afterwards that I was using it wrong. So how I was using it was essentially, I have a pattern already generated. I've kind of already made it sound really good and I'm happy with it. And then I'm going to try and use the brain. And it would often just kind of sound a bit like this. Just a bit of a garbled mess of notes, and it doesn't actually really sound very musical at all. And I think I have figured out where I was going wrong. So the way that I found the brain to be really useful is actually when you treat it as part of the compositional process. So in this example that I'm going to show you, I have a single bass note that is essentially the root note. We're essentially playing almost like a single chord, and we are then using the brain to shift that around in key. And that's creating the chord changes, and that's creating the tonal interest. So I actually kind of think of it a bit like an omnichord, but because it's kind of telling you the scale that you're playing in, you don't even need to know the other chords that work in the scale in the way that an omnichord does, and you actually get to make your own pattern. So it's kind of like an intelligent omnichord, really. So I kind of used this example that sounds particularly omnichordy as a way to describe that. So here's our single loop variationless pattern, and it'll just keep doing this. But when I start getting the brain involved with this keypad, and it'll tell me which notes to play, I'm going to generate some interesting chord changes. So in treating it this way, you can kind of create really interesting patterns that I would never have come up with myself. And obviously this was quite a corny example, because I really love corny omnichord sorts of sounds. They kind of remind me of Beach House, but here's an example that's slightly less corny. So in this example, we've got a single bar that doesn't really change that much. It kind of sounds like this. But with our brain, it sounds like this. Which is honestly something I probably wouldn't have written otherwise. And you can also do interesting stuff where you don't have to play the same octave as well. And another thing I noticed with the brain is you don't actually need the sequencer to run in order to use it. Which is really nice because, again, you can kind of do slightly different stuff and maybe treat it a little bit more like an instrument rather than a sort of sequence, which I find really interesting. So here's that same piece, but we've done it an octave lower in the brain, so it's kind of transposed everything down an octave. We're also running it through this Nagra tape machine, which is in mono, so the track is now going to revert to mono, and it's actually running a tape loop, so there are sort of like little crinkles and little weird bits in it as well. But yeah, this is what it sounds like. So hopefully this video has given you a good idea of some of the new features and given you a bit of a glimpse as to what the OPXY can do. I've really enjoyed using the OPXY, and if I had to speak about this versus the OP1 field, I'd say that the XY is probably a little bit better suited to creating whole tracks on. I think that sequencer workflow really adds to the ability to just make a full song. Where I think the OP1 field is a little bit better is it feels a little bit more of an instrument to play, and you can kind of create different palettes using the tape that I really enjoy. The OPXY is available at signalsounds.com. All of our links are just below. And thank you so much for watching. See you next time.